somehow the Virginia governor's race this year turned into a referendum on the progressive agenda for America's school children, not to mention being the country's first major political contest test since 2016, in which Donald Trump was not the central figure. And while the children of Virginia wait to find out how much critical theory they're going to be subjected to, and whether they have to get a jab in order to stay in class, in the meanwhile, the nation's fiscal sanity hangs by a thread in Congress. We'll discuss all this and so much more on today's episode of Independent Outlook. Hi, I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We are right across the bay from San Francisco, and we get together frequently here with many of our friends around the country, trying to give you an independent take on the news that you're probably not likely to hear elsewhere. And for this conversation, I am joined as always by my two extremely erudite and well-informed colleagues. First of all, David Theroux, president of the Independent Institute. Hi, David.
Hey, Graham.
Great to see you. And also by Williamson Evers, Bill Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Hello, Bill.
Hello.
Great to see you. Great to see all of our friends who are with us today. Many of us are joining us through our YouTube channel, Facebook page, Twitter, Vimeo, etc. We're grateful for all of our friends. And I just remind you all, if you are participating, most of those platforms have ways of submitting comments, and they will get to me. And we'll try and have some response to your comments and questions. So, Bill, David, let's get started. Let's talk about Virginia. Larry Sabato, who's famous for his crystal ball in Virginia, has just shifted the race to leans Republican as of, I think, yesterday or the day before. No, I think it was yesterday. This is a battle which seems to be getting the nation's attention. An hour from now, an hour from the time that we're having this conversation, at least, the polls will close in Virginia. Why does the Virginia race, David, why does the Virginia race matter so much to people?
Because the Democrat candidate, McAuliffe, who is former governor of Virginia, was viewed as a shoo-in. And this whole issue of education exploded, as well as the declining ranking of approval for Joe Biden and generally the Democratic Party's vision and efforts. So the candidate, Youngkin, who is challenging the Democratic Party hold, which includes the House of Delegates in Virginia, is now in dispute. And there's a big shift, not just among Republican voters, but also heavily for independents and Democrats, to Youngkin, which is shifting. It's not just on the margins. It's many of the key constituents that the Democratic Party has counted on, many of which also shifted to Trump when Trump was running. Mm-hmm. And the question, was that just a fluke? So there are a lot of Democrats who are afraid that this is actually part of a trend among Hispanics and Asians and Blacks and so on, suburban women. And so the issue of education, which many people viewed as sort of a minor culture war issue, is now been put at the top of the list. And the rallies for Youngkin and other developments have been quite substantial. Bill follows this more closely than I do. So, Bill, you might want to add to.
Well, I noticed that when Barack Obama came to town in Virginia, it was about a week and a half ago, he chided people for getting all wound up about what he called fake culture wars. But I think that the culture wars of Virginia are not the usual kind. They're about some very specific things in education, aren't they, Bill?
Yes, they are. I would say, even though we're paying a lot of attention to it, and even the newspapers are paying a lot of attention to it, the main broadcast networks, ABC, NBC, and CBS, did not cover Virginia the night before the election.
You're kidding.
No. So, it's different if you watch Newsmax or Fox or something like that. There's almost too much coverage of Virginia.
Well, all the major leaders of the Democratic Party have been converging on Virginia in alarm and concern, so it must be a big deal.
I think it's obviously a big deal, and McAuliffe is running scared. And several pollsters have found Fox having Youngkin 8 points ahead is the outlier, but there are others that show at least a couple points ahead. The Fox local station in Washington, D.C. shows Youngkin a couple of points ahead. So I think he's at least on track to win. The primary issues have been critical race theory, which the former governor says isn't even taught in Virginia schools, despite the fact that back when he was governor, his Department of Education sent out all sorts of recommendations of books about critical race theory and put on the website that the teachers should teach the children critical race theory. So, and also the parents say that they're actually getting it in the classroom. So
I just saw that report, just briefly, Bill, report yesterday where a mother was complaining before a school board meeting in Loudoun County, where I was a resident for about 10 years, that her little girl came home, I think she was in 6th grade, very somber, and said, "Mommy, is it true that I was born evil because I'm white?"
Yeah, there you go. So there are several other related issues. So one is there's a book by Toni Morrison that's been in the library that depicts various savage acts, various sexual assaults and things pretty graphically. And a parent complained about it, and there was a statute in Virginia that passed the legislature that said that parents could weigh in on things like that. And McAuliffe, back when he was governor, vetoed it. So when you see him saying parents shouldn't be able to take a book out and look at it and say something, that's what he's talking about specifically. So then there's a third horrifying thing that happened, and that the New York Times has really tried to downplay. And so that has to do with transsexual bathrooms. So
I can just hear people, closing their ears saying, "Oh, I'm tired of this subject."
Well, I mean, the facts are worth reporting. And so a boy dressed in a skirt raped a girl in the girl's bathroom. And then his father was wrestled to the ground by the police when he got into a heated exchange with another person at a school board meeting, where she said he was lying about this incident. And he emphatically, said, no, he wasn't lying. And anyway, the police tackled him. And during that meeting, the superintendent said that there's no cases of this sort of transsexual rape and boys in the girls' bathroom. And so there's no problems. And then the student was transferred to another school and engaged in another sexual assault.
You mean the violator was transferred?
Yeah, not the victim, but the alleged abuser. Neither of these cases has gone through completely the law. So these are all accusations. But
a judge has ruled on the first one.
That's right. That had happened. Okay. So anyway, so the superintendent was lying, and the father was wrestled to the ground. Very graphic video, and then this incident was cited by the National School Boards Association in a letter to the Justice Department saying, look, domestic terrorism is going on. Our school boards are threatened by these parents. And they left out the fact that parents that want to protect their children and obviously are criticizing critical race theory. And so the National School Board Association had been collaborating for weeks with the Biden White House on the wording of this letter. It's sent to the Justice Department, and the Justice Department promptly responds with a memorandum saying they're going to aggressively look into this, and please send your worries and comments into the FBI's counterintelligence.
In other
hotline.
words, snitch on your fellow parents who are getting too emphatic in their resistance to school policy.
The whole thing is very ugly.
It really is.
So you can hardly blame the parents for being truly at the barricades over this. And it's not just white parents, it's all different kind of parents. And so this is a big problem for the Democrats. And so what are they doing? They're doubling down, and they're saying,
Right.
we're right. You know, you racist, how dare you bring up critical race theory, that's a dog whistle, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're just digging themselves deeper.
And which is why Terry McAuliffe, former governor, now governor candidate,
Right.
Today, he said a few weeks ago that parents shouldn't be telling schools what to teach their children. And then I've read
they should have no say, is what he said.
Yeah, and it's kind of stunning. I've read some interesting defenses of Terry McAuliffe having made that comment. The defenses go something like this: that, well, the school boards are the ones who tell the schools what the curriculum should be, and the school boards are elected by the public. The school boards are not somehow delegates of the parents specifically, and therefore the parents really shouldn't be talking about what they want because it's the general public and the school boards, which seems like to me a very strained argument to somehow silence the parents because others vote in school board elections too. But that's been the argument that I've read to somehow justify Mr. McAuliffe's statement.
Well, the view is that the collective decision of the election overrules any individual choice.
Mm-hmm.
And the other incidents that have come out as a result of this, a number of schools had students announce that they're going to walk out in protest over sexual abuse.
They had a big walkout in Loudoun
They had a
County.
big walkout, right? And a number, I think it was about 4 or 5 different schools.
Right.
And so the Democrats
all the high schools in Loudoun County.
Right. So the Democrats are tone deaf to this because of, one, their allegiance to the teacher unions, and two, because they do buy this progressive narrative that they're the elite, they're the experts, and the parents are yokels and need to be talked down to, essentially, and the children are wards of the state, essentially. The government is between the parents and the children. So I should also throw in the fact that this also has come to light after the lockdowns, in which parents discovered what was actually being taught in the schools. It wasn't just the incident of a child coming home and telling them they're supposed to be admitting themselves as being an oppressor, and the whole white guilt trip is issue. But the fact that the parents were seeing what was actually being taught in the schools as far as transgender ideology, CRT, critical race theory, and so forth. And this whole narrative of the 1619 Project and yada, yada. So parents have realized that the schools have not been what they've been told, and they've been pretty much deferring to the schools as the experts, and now they realize they've got to get their act together because
they realized it because they got more exposed to the content because the kids were at home doing it by Zoom. That's right. Partly what's going on, right, David?
Right. And so a lot of the parents also were desperate during this lockdown period of what do we do with our kids? Mm-hmm. So they're looking to options, which can be expensive. So it's, charter schools and private schools and homeschooling and so on, but realizing that they're still being forced to pay for these schools, and the teachers union members still are being paid even though they're not teaching. So you throw in the COVID problem in the economy and unemployment and the antics of Biden and so on, and it's just created a big cultural rift, and it's growing. This is not just Loudoun County. This is all across the country. And,
so one thing that's evidence of this is that the school enrollments in New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles have all gone down.
Yep.
And the New York Post just had an editorial about how the New York public school system is hiding this. So what they've done is they've put in all the preschool students, whether in public or private programs.
What?
And they put them into the total, which had never been in the total before, to hide the missing kids that were above pre-K. So I think this has to be a great example of obfuscation and pretense by deceit by which the New York school system practices all the time. I would add also to David's point about the teachers union is talk about maladroit clothes. McAuliffe had his final rally with Randy Weingarten, the national head of the American Federation of Teachers Union.
Wow.
Who possibly more than any single individual kept children out of schools during the lockdown period and demanded, a zillion different things. Firemen are working, policemen are working, postal delivery people are working, your neighbor's sandwich shop is working, but the teachers weren't there, even though kids don't transmit, kids don't really get it. Teachers are generally below 65 years old. And they all these countries in Europe had the schools open the whole time. So anyway, Randy Weingarten is probably this individual most responsible for the school lockdown, and that's who he invited.
Wow.
And also the Washington Post ran an article saying, you think children and parents should have something to say about what children are taught in school. They shouldn't. Not a piece on the Washington Times opinion page.
Washington
and Randy
Post.
Weingarten had just tweeted this out, approving this article. So, talk about kicking the parents in the teeth. Anyway.
There's one piece I'd like to go back to with Bill, if I could. Excuse me, David, but before we move on too far, because I know you've given a lot of thought to this CRT stuff, Bill.
Right.
But Governor McAuliffe, former Governor McAuliffe, he said that critical race theory is not taught in Virginia. And Miguel Cardona, the education secretary of President Biden, he was asked on a TV program if CRT is taught in schools, in American schools. It is not, he declared. And so there's this major claim. It's not a nuanced claim. It's a very bald claim that it is not being taught. So I have a thought here. And I want to bounce it off of you, Bill, if I may.
All right.
My thought is that some of the people who apparently, in good conscience, are claiming that critical race theory is not being taught, I wonder if what they're doing in their mind is a kind of little micro-analytical dance, as it were. I've heard some of the people from that side saying, well, we are not no one is teaching the children the theoretical constructs by which we analyze societies and so forth. We're not teaching them that theoretical apparatus as if they were in graduate school, because that's not appropriate for kids. Well, maybe that's true, but my theory is that if they're not teaching the theory as a theory, they're simply implementing it without teaching it. They're implementing the dogmas of the theory, telling kids, for example, that they have to find their unconscious racism and own their white privilege and so forth, is not teaching them the theory exactly. It's just doing the theory. Maybe that's what's going on here. How do we explain the strange, bald, and obviously false claim that it's not being taught? That's my theory. What do you say, Bill?
I think that's right. I think, in terms of citing people from the Frankfurt School that supplied
they're not doing
background that. Or Paulo Freire or various things like that. They're obviously not teaching that to high schools, but they're teaching them, you're born white, you're a born racist. Unless you become an ally, unless you become a woke activist, a social justice warrior. So they are teaching critical race theory. They are teaching critical theory. They are teaching for social justice. They are teaching, there's all these different ways to describe basically the same thing. And it is being taught all over America, and it's certainly being taught in Virginia. And they have Christopher Rufo and others have discovered receipts from the consultants who are specialists on critical race theory for training the teachers and administrators in critical race theory from recent times in Virginia. So, okay, they weren't teaching them this, but it says they were. That's what the taxpayers paid for. So, I mean, something's got to give here.
there's Merrick Garland's daughter's husband, who
Right.
is the CEO of Panorama Education, which sells these progressive CRT-oriented diversity seminars to schools all over America for a
Yeah.
tidy sum. And now his father-in-law, the Attorney General of the United States, is threatening to bring federal power to bear on those who object to the product which his son-in-law sells. I find that troubling.
Attorney General Garland was questioned in front of Congress on this. And he said, my memo was solely about violence. How dare you ask me about any conflict of interest with my son-in-law? I didn't write about the conflict. And the congressmen were all asking him, well, did you bother to consult with a lawyer before writing this memo in case you were, in fact, pushing something that your son-in-law would be benefiting from? And he declined. He obviously hadn't. If he had consulted with a lawyer and the lawyer had said it's fine, he would have said so. So he didn't do it. And
we have a comment coming in from one of our participants, Michael, who is wondering why Obama, Clinton, and all former Democratic presidents need to show up at city, county, and state elections to get Democrats elected. Why, and I'll turn to David maybe for this one, why, Michael wants to know, is it so urgent to bring top Democrats into state and local races at this point?
Well, what McAuliffe did is he nationalized the race right there. And he's been a long-time operative for the Clintons and others, and he believes that this is a way to rise above it. But this, and ironically enough, Youngkin did the opposite. He kept it a local issue. He didn't nationalize it. He didn't bring in Republican leaders or Trump or whoever it might be, because it's a grassroots phenomenon. And he embraced it and actually became a leader of the rebellion against it. And so these parents, especially the mothers, have had their eyes open during this pandemic lockdown, seeing what their children are being taught or not taught. And then we find out that these same people, McAuliffe and others, including these national leaders that McAuliffe brought in, including Obama, whoever, are essentially for mandated vaccines for the children. And so it's just this whole panoply of realizations that the schools are out of control, the Democratic Party is not accountable, there are threats to my family, and we need something else. So it's quite an interesting situation. In many respects, McAuliffe has handed the GOP an election issue which was not even in the top 10, roughly. It's now perhaps the number one issue in Virginia, and it's growing to be number one across the country. I mean, in San Francisco, you have people trying to change the names of public schools. They're dumbing down the math requirements. They're hiding the fact that they're not giving preferential treatment to different groups. And the parents are finding this is not just something that's in the news across the country. It is right in my own school.
Right.
So
San Francisco, I think, if I could just clarify, San Francisco used to have a merit-based public high school, Lowell High School. This high school still exists, but it's an exam-based entrance. And so they've suspended that. And so, and that is part of this whole race consciousness politics that we're getting.
Tell us, Bill, a little bit about California's equity math emphasis. It's part of our particular take on this issue in California.
Well, it's part of this SEL phenomenon too, right, Bill?
That's related. So originally, social emotive learning had to do with resolution, stalwartness, stick-to-itiveness, grit. I don't know that you have to teach this, but it's a good value to have in high school and in life. But it's evolved into being, once again, critical race theory. So, but the thing about math is kind of twofold in California. So on the one hand, they're bringing in race here and there, and they're saying that teachers need to train the students to be activists in future life, and they're going to have word problems that have to do with political activism rather than buying, more often they're travel. So-and-so's on a train going one direction, so-and-so, or somebody's in a grocery store buying things and so forth. So they're going to have political activism, no question. And so there's that going on. There's another thing called trauma-based education, which is similar in a way to the social emotional learning. And the idea is that huge swaths of the population have been traumatized by existing institutions in American society, so they have to have a kind of therapeutic education.
I'm feeling good about that education.
Oh, it's some horrible nanny state on steroids that they're going to have in the schools, but racially infused. And so this is in the proposed math framework, curriculum framework for California. Then the other thing they're doing is they're saying that kids can't have advanced work in mathematics until 11th grade. So if they're going to be on track to take AB or BC calculus in their senior year, or maybe even before if they're really, really smart and skilled and knowledgeable, they're going to be in very bad shape to try to catch all the way up in 11th grade. So normally, schools begin in middle school giving advanced work to able students, people who show that they have skill in math and achieve in math. And this is blocking that. So they're doing this also in the name of equity. So equity normally means fairness. They have a war against the word equality, because equality in America normally means equality before the law, equal respect. It's something that comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition also. And they don't like equality, so they're going for equity because they can put their political program as kind of an entering wedge for any kind of radical egalitarian political program.
David, you might want to mention to our friends who are with us on the program today our own initiative here in California to take a stand against the politicization of mathematics with our open letter.
Yes, this is something that actually was launched by Bill and one of our fellows, Zev Verman, and it's a critique of a proposed math curriculum on the state level for K through 12, especially in higher 8th grade and above. And it is essentially politicizing math. It's basically saying that math doesn't have objective standing. It only has standing when you look at it through essentially critical race theory and SEL and other terms that are being essentially it's wokeness in math, and of course that is a stepping stone directly to wokeness in science. So we invited academics from about 50 schools in the state. We now have over 1,000 signatories. We also invited venture capitalists. We invited scientists and leaders from different tech companies, all of which are heavily dependent upon the integrity of mathematics. And
they see the graduates of the public schools.
That's right. They see the graduates of the public schools. And so, again, as I was saying before, the rude awakening has occurred because of the lockdown, and parents are beginning to see what's going on. And it's not just situational to a few examples. I mean, getting back to your point, your question, Graham, about McAuliffe bringing in all these national Democratic leaders, he's bringing in Stacey Abrams and Obama and Harris and so on and so forth, and they all are saying the same thing. So it is really a pejorative that these parents are learning that their kids are being used as essentially guinea pigs, and also are being assumed to be wards of the state. When we then enter into the pandemic arena, we're talking about vaccinating children from 5 years and older with vaccines that have never been approved for children. The total testing period for children is 3 months at this point. So the FDA has 3 months of testing. Is that supposed to predict the impact on children, especially a group that has less than 1% mortality probability from having COVID? Is that where the emphasis should be? So this whole mantra is building against progressives. And the average parent across the political spectrum is learning this. That's why the Loudoun County story is so significant. This is the richest county in the country and one of the bluest counties in the country. Mm-hmm. So I think what we're talking about is something that Democrats are getting fearful of. They're afraid this is going to jeopardize the initiatives they have in the Congress for their mega gazillion, trillion, Brazilian measures. They're concerned about the narrative that they're using to push these measures, whether it's climate, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's racism, and so on and so forth. So things are heating up, and whatever happens today, at the very minimum, it shows that the Democratic Party's control over the political culture in blue areas is not guaranteed now. Again, remember that if we assume the election outcomes of 2020, I think Trump lost Virginia by, was it 10 points?
10 points.
Yes.
Right? And so what does this mean for other states? Again,
and he lost Loudoun County by even more than 10 points.
That's right. Loudoun County even more than 10 points. So I think they're worried, and for good reason.
You know, I want to come back to questions of COVID and the bazillion, trillion, however many thing in Congress. But we did invite our friends on the line to make some comments. There's some interesting comments that I'm getting as we're talking about this. One of our participants is named John, and here's what he says. This is interesting. He says, teaching CRT is nuanced. Teachers are trained in it and use it to develop content. They do not teach it in the schools. And
that's what you were trying to say.
Yeah.
That's what you were trying to say, Grant.
Interesting point.
I think that's right. They're obviously not teaching elaborate graduate school level theory. They're teaching stuff that's seen through the lens of that theory.
That's right. It is shaped by it. Yeah, good point, John, of course. And John's observation then, leads to some nuance in the appropriate response to this problem. And this, of course, has to be wrangled out at the school board levels all around the country, for sure. But to simply ban the teaching of critical race theory may not be quite the way to put it. It may be far better to do what some states have done, which is to make it clear that the state's schools shall not teach that one race is inferior to another, for example.
Things like that.
Right.
I do
and
think
to uphold the integrity of different subject areas.
Yes.
I do think that some of these ordinances where they say nothing should be taught that makes you feel bad, I think that goes too far.
Yeah, I mean, conservatives want that.
People sometimes put these laws together in a hurry. So, but anyway, you can learn about things in America's past that we should be proud of, but also some things that we shouldn't, and so that might make you feel bad, and even if you didn't do it, right?
Right.
Anyway,
there's stuff to feel bad about, and there's stuff to feel good about. I want the facts. I don't want ideology.
Exactly.
I want the facts.
Exactly. But they should. I think the laws that say you shouldn't teach that one race is inferior to another, or one race is diabolic, or whatever. I think that's fine. I don't think that's wrong. And the courts have upheld. There's no, the teacher doesn't have a right to say whatever he or she feels like in the classroom. The teacher is an employee of the government, and if the state legislature wants to say XYZ, then the teacher also has to say XYZ.
So another
one thing
which might be a reason to go to private school.
That's right. And on that subject, right behind me is the cover of a book that we published called Really Good Schools by James Tooley, which explores the great advantage of creating low-cost, high-quality private schools for the poor and everybody else. And the extensive research that he did that went into this is the kind of information that parents are desperately looking for, as well as the understanding of the case for such educational schools and opportunities. In other words, the narrative, the progressive narrative again, that the only way that the poor can get educated is through public schools, which are run, as we've seen, is simply false. And so giving people direction is a lot of what I think is needed, especially at this time, and it's simply going to build as parents are facing more and more of this retrenchment by the orthodox public school establishment. Incidentally, I should also mention that SEL and CRT and a lot of these other measures have come to dominate most of the colleges and schools of education. Okay. So there is a certain arrogance and presumptuousness that these schools have and educators have, that they are the ones in the know, and the bumpkin proletariat parents who knows what they voted for should have no say because we're the experts.
You know,
as David pointed out, Loudoun County is a well-to-do county, one of the richer ones in the country, and many highly educated people live there. And so, people who are not well educated also have a right and should have a say in what their children are taught. But in terms of claiming that Loudoun County people are country bumpkins, it's just crazy.
Yeah, that's even crazy, right? Yeah. We have someone on the program with us, participant called Kirsten. She says, the answer is homeschool. Best decision I ever made. That probably is a pretty wise decision, Kirsten. Let's turn the page, however, if I may, gentlemen. We were talking a moment ago about COVID and the school children being subjected to all sorts of requirements and restrictions. But the recent news coming out of the National Institutes for Health on the question of gain-of-function research is pretty striking. Either of you want to tackle that? I think we've learned something recently about what's been funded.
Well, I think the questions that Senator Rand Paul has posed to Anthony Fauci about the issue of gain-of-function research in the U.S., essentially the NIH and NIAID complicity in funding that through EcoHealth Alliance and other places probably, has become even more secure. The NIH sent a letter in which they're essentially apologizing for what they did. Francis Collins has resigned as the head of NIH. Fauci continues to double down with all sorts of obfuscation. But I think he's being viewed as an arrogant person who is not reliable, not trustworthy. He speaks out of both sides of his mouth. He's basically a tool of sort of the pandemic oligarchs, not to mention big pharma. And so I think the credibility of the Centers for Disease Control and the FDA and other federal agencies that allegedly are the experts has radically decreased, and more and more people are looking for answers. But I think we're going to find that certain circles are going to continue to defend these policies. I mean, the view, my body, myself, and my choice, and so on, it apparently has been lost in the progressive world.
Interesting point, David.
I wanted to follow up on David's point that Fauci may well not have been telling the truth a few times. So
yes,
Victor
right.
Davis Hanson, the famous commentator, has a column out on American greatness, and we have it also on Independent Institute's website. And it references the noble lie. So Plato wrote about the myth of the metals, how the caste system in his Commonwealth, with his utopian or dystopian to some of us Commonwealth, was going to work. And this was a noble lie that would be taught to the people. And Hanson's point is that all these politicians and bureaucrats these days that are telling lies to the public think to themselves that they're doing it for the common good. They're doing it for the public good. And that justifies thinking that whatever they do is for the public good. Means they just have a license to lie. And so they, and one of his prime examples, of course, is Fauci. Excellent column. Well worth reading.
Yeah, it definitely is worth reading. So what I did notice, however, is that the admission of funding of gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through EcoHealth Alliance was a qualified admission. I found this rather striking. Unless I'm missing a detail, and maybe one of you can correct me, it appears that there was an acknowledgement that there was funding indirectly of gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute on viruses other than the one which became COVID-19. Which is interesting that they had to make that careful distinction. That, well, it turns out we did fund bad research, but it couldn't possibly have been connected to the worldwide tragedy and all the millions of deaths.
Well,
right.
it's
incoherent what they said, because they claim they don't know where the COVID-19 virus came from. And yet they're claiming it couldn't possibly have come from these others.
Those are two different claims.
Two different claims, but also there are other scientists, epidemiologists and physicists and others who've looked into the modeling and the various aspects of the COVID-19 virus, the version of SARS, and they say, and point out that there's no way that this could have come from a wet market, and that it had to have been human designed. The Intercept recently released information that they got, which basically confirms a lot of this, that the lying was persistent. And again, this is all that we're seeing really is the pulling back of the curtain, that the emperor has no clothes. The wizard is trying to pull switches, and in reality, it's just a show.
So I want to add to what David and Graham have said, and it's obvious that deception or some kind of shell game is being played with what went on with this funding. And I think we're completely right. It's our own government, and so we should be criticizing and condemning them for this. But I also just want to say that the Chinese government has been even worse.
Mm-hmm.
They have not allowed people to dig into the data. They can't seem to explain why 3 scientists were sick in November. They can't, it's just, they could really clarify the science of what happened, and it's a cover-up. And so I just want to throw in that the Communist Party there has a lot of blood on its hands.
I mean, what's
including the fact that the Wuhan lab does work, and in my opinion, is essentially an arm of the Chinese military.
And it has very shoddy protections, very shoddy
protection. That's right.
Precautions.
Exactly. It was, in fact, the comparison that was made is its safety measures are equivalent to a dentist's office.
Exactly. I saw that also.
Wow.
Yeah.
But what's interesting in this context is that we've been talking about the ways in which expert, elite wielders of knowledge have been calling the shots in so many cases. China operates unapologetically under an ideology that proclaims a small set of people at the top, namely the Communist Party members, really do have knowledge that no one else has. They are the supreme experts in the Marxist laws of history. In some ways, that explains why they don't even flinch by commanding a whole society by alleged experts, political experts. At least in America, we still flinch, and may we continue to do so.
If Biden's budget plans and all his new programs and expanded programs come to all this false expertise and centralized technocratic guidance and rules, are going to be even more all over our society.
I feel so sorry for Joe Manchin. I mean, he must be getting so sick of those kayaks that they swarm around his boat in the Potomac River. And poor Senator Sinema, she can't hardly go into the restroom without people badgering her. Those two seem to be the thread on which our fiscal sanity is hanging.
I think Manchin, deserves some credit. I'm hardly really a Joe Manchin fan in terms of what he's for positively, but he's pointing out that instead of doing the calculations out 10 years, these guys are, we'll put it for only a few years and then we'll renew it. And so that's how they're cutting it, the final number.
And he's calling that a shell game.
Yeah, he's right, though. He's exactly right.
Right.
And they don't want to cut programs from their proposal. They just want to cut the timeline. Well, he's calling that out. I think he's completely right, and it's a typical Washington ploy. And another fabulous story in this was a thing in the Los Angeles Times where they went out and interviewed people and said, would you like free X? Would you like free Y? Would you like free Z? And they all
said, I want free stuff.
Please, give me free stuff. And then they said, well, would you be willing to pay $1,000 more in taxes every year to get this?
No.
Nobody was for that. I mean, it was. They think this is coming from the sky. They think it's manna from heaven. It's not. Somebody's going to pay taxes. There aren't enough rich people to pay for this huge. Remember, we already passed a rescue plan. This is all on top of that.
That's right.
Trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. And there's just, if we confiscate all the ultra wealthy, we could run the American federal government for a week. But this is, a big expansion of the federal government.
Well, we can keep borrowing money from the Chinese Communist Party, apparently.
Well,
so the polls show that the issue of inflation has taken over the lead, and the pandemic, I think, is like number 8 or 10.
Wow.
So again, it's this accumulation, and then, as I mentioned before, of course, and most people are probably aware that Biden's approval rating continues to drop like a rock.
And people don't think his programs are going to make a positive difference either.
Right. And they see him in the news in Paris or in Glasgow falling asleep, and so on and so forth. So every aspect fulfills this question that maybe things are out of control. And I think voter regret is also coming into a major reality. If you look at the polls now, apparently something like 35% believe that the election should be recalled, which is astounding. But the Democrats, certainly the progressives, are so hell-bent on their agenda and afraid that they're going to lose the opportunity to implement the Green New Deal and so on and so forth. They're trying to ram everything through and demonize anybody who questions it. So,
you're all racist. If you're against us, you're a racist. There's no other possible explanation.
But people are saying that's baloney, and they're being clued into what can I do? So the more that this spreads, the more it becomes a real movement to rein in the power of these elites.
So you mentioned inflation, David, and I think we could have a bit of a segue on this because it is very prominent in people's worries and fears right now.
Yep.
So the classic situation is the government expands the money supply. So the scene of Milton Friedman shutting off the printing press. It's a classic thing on his TV series.
In Free to Choose, yeah.
Yeah. And so too much money is chasing too few goods, and that causes the prices to all go up. Now, Alex Salter, who's an economist at Texas Tech and affiliated with Independent Institute, had a very interesting column in the Wall Street Journal. And, he doesn't deny that throughout this pandemic and in earlier time periods, there have been a lot of buying of bonds and all the things that the Fed does in order to expand the money supply. But he says, look, you can also have, when you have too much money chasing too few goods, you can have too few goods. And so the supply chain crisis is feeding the inflationary situation. And so he says a major thing that needs to be done is to deregulate or loosen regulations that are holding back the supply chain.
Yep.
And so some examples of that are, who can drive a truck? How old do you have to be?
Right.
Why can't we automate? Foreign countries have highly automated ports. Our longshoremen's union, we have two of them, one on the West Coast and one on the East Coast. One historically affiliated with the mafia, the other historically affiliated with the Communist Party, but that's just history. Anyway, the longshoremen's union doesn't want any automation, and that would, of course, vastly speed up this stuff. Another problem is trucks and fuel, and the trucks have to be able to burn California fuels to clear. We have very peculiar fuel requirements in California, and trucks have to be built in a certain way. Well, there are not enough trucks to match this. So all these regulation problems are getting in the way of clearing the ports. We see hundreds of ships sitting out offshore, and that's your Christmas present for your niece or something like that.
And some of them are dragging anchors that are pulling open oil pipelines.
Yeah, that's happening too.
And one of the aspects too, Bill, about trucking is in California, this measure AB5 that was passed
absolutely
had a huge impact on owner-operated trucks.
Right.
And a huge percentage of the trucking that is done in the Los Angeles and Long Beach ports is owner-operated trucks.
Right. So that's a problem. There's some federal pushback on that.
Yeah.
I will say, if you can drive a truck in the Army at age 18, I don't know why you can't, as an owner of a truck or is working for a trucking company.
Well, the AB5 measure is to eliminate essentially
independent,
right, exactly. And so the unions are behind that too, and the average person is paying for it. One thing that the unions don't pay attention to, I think sufficiently, is that this raises the price of goods and services for their members.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And in other words, they're claiming that on net they're representing working class people and they're benefiting from it. But when you go to a certain point, there's a tipping point where their members begin to really feel it, and that also carries over.
Look at gasoline prices also.
Exactly, and it also relates to the rebellion against the schools. So I think that there's a naivete that the elite can essentially have something for nothing in their measures and not have any sort of accountability from these enormously poor policies that they're being imposed on people.
Well, now, regarding the supply chain crisis, that's related to inflation. Obviously, it's going to exacerbate it, potentially could. It could become a frightening kind of crisis for people if supply chain doesn't get back into full gear. And notice, if this analysis is correct, and I think it certainly must be largely correct, that the supply chain constrictions come from a whole series of restrictions and regulations, either enacted on behalf of some alleged public good or enacted to protect union jobs or various things, causing the constriction, worsening the constriction. A very possible response to this could well be, and I've seen people calling for this already, if the supply chain gets too mucked up, we have to send in the National Guard to make sure that goods...
Or we have to end imports of everything because,
right.
doll dolls made in Japan are somehow a national interest. Can't have.
But the pattern is
the dolls at Christmas. Christmas
right.
is a national security matter. Look, just get the dolls off the boats and get them to the kids or the parents of the kids.
Notice
another global thing that's going on is global taxation.
So, tell us about that.
Well, you know, there's competition between countries to offer attractive locations. They try to make laws that are friendly to commerce. They try to have tax regimes that are attractive, especially for people starting up in these countries. Ireland is very famous for doing this. In a sense, the United States is in some ways more attractive than some other countries to do business in. But governments don't like people seeking low tax venues to set up the companies, because then the politicians and bureaucrats who live off of and get power and influence from tax revenues don't get as much as they think they should have. So they're trying to have a minimum global tax. The Biden people are in this, hip deep in this. But the thing is, you know, not only is the taxation bad and, you know, not encourage people to go to the best locations to make things, but they're doing it unconstitutionally. They can't be imposing taxes on the American public through treaties and executive agreements. We have taxation without representation, something we've fought about in the past in American history. So they're just proceeding on their merry way. I do think the Supreme Court will not be too happy with this. But
oh no, they'll throw a wrench into it. But why should they have to? We should just abide by our own.
No, that's right. The government should try to live up to the constitutional authorities that granted to them, and not go around bursting through the Constitution in every hand, which they're doing.
Yeah, the route that the Biden crowd is pursuing and in Congress is reminiscent of a short book by the economist Ludwig von Mises called Planned Chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And basically,
that's just what I was thinking, David.
In fact, he actually, as a number of lectures he gave, I believe it was in Argentina in the 50s probably. And anyway, the point is that in the 1970s, we had what is now known as stagflation, where you had inflation and high inflation, high unemployment at the same time, which the Keynesians believed you could not have. And we're on the route to do that again as shortages increase and prices go up. The extreme inflation measures, of course, is called hyperinflation, and unemployment, empty shelves, and so forth. And the progressive fallacy, sort of fatal conceit, is that some sort of central planning measure, if they just had enough power, enough money, they will harmonize everything. And the more they try to intervene and regulate and set prices and whatever, the worse it gets. So it's one of the key measures that von Mises was critiquing, and Milton Friedman, and others in this classical liberal tradition. But again, the incentives of politicians and interest groups is to use government power to enrich themselves, and claiming that it's in the public interest as they do so.
And then the public is clamoring for politicians to do something.
Yes.
So government controls cause problems. The public then says, oh, do something. And so then more government controls are deployed to do something to solve the problems caused by government controls, and it can be a vicious cycle.
Well, that's
what
why
we
this
need
movement,
is for government to stop doing something.
Right. So that's why this movement of parents and just the general public against the schools and against the inflation and all the rest of it, they're learning for it. They're looking for explanations.
Against paying $450,000 to people who were separated at the border.
Exactly. And so, I mean, if so, you essentially you're talking about a two-parent family, essentially becoming
they got $1 million practically.
Right, essentially $1 million. And so again, this is so dramatically absurd that people say, what is going on? You know, I didn't buy this. I thought Biden was a moderate. What's all this about? And so that kind of spirit is why, again, the Democrats are worried, because the public is very quickly moving against this. And so that's the only thing really, in my opinion, will stop this trend, which we've had to endure for a long time. And since Biden's election, it's just been accelerated almost without limit. So that's the good news, is that people are
rising up
increasingly.
angry.
That's right, exactly.
And one of our goals as an organization here at the Independent Institute is precisely to help people make sense of these things that sometimes are deliberately obfuscated and made more obscure. That's why we have these conversations. We aim to educate the public and where we can to shed some light, hopefully more light than heat. And we try and do it not by ranting at you, but trying to analyze with you. We invite you to visit our website, independent.org, where you can always find a whole trove of policy analysis that will be from a point of view that is not typical in the media, I'll tell you that. Let me turn back to my friends for maybe any final comments. You want to make a prediction on the vote in Virginia tonight, Bill?
Well, I think that Youngkin is going to win, but I think even if he doesn't win, it puts a proper scare into the Democrats, and it does show a pathway to successful electioneering in the near future.
Yep, that's right. I agree with Bill. I also would like to point out that Insight Central on this whole range of education issues and the rebellion against it is the Center on Educational Excellence, which is directed by Bill. So that's really the go-to place to understand the curricular issues and the choice issues and on and on. So I want to thank Bill for what he's doing and his whole team.
Yeah, we are very grateful for Bill's work.
Thank you to both of you for making a place for the center and enhancing it at this most opportune time, because it may be the central issue of the next few years in America's public agenda.
Yeah, indeed, it may well be. Okay, well, thank you to both David Theroux and Williamson Evers for this interesting conversation and your insights. Thank you for all of our friends who've joined us. Thank you for the many comments. I tried to include as many of them as I could. Please join us again in a couple weeks when we do this again. We'll probably have a retrospective as well as a prospective. And please come back frequently to independent.org and join us again for Independent Outlook in the future. Thanks, everybody. See you again soon. Bye-bye.